I'm Anthony Appiah. I teach here and in the philosophy department at NYU, and I'm your chair for this discussion of freedom of expression, mostly on campus. But I should begin by introducing, I'm only going to tell you the names of the people here. You will discover who they are as they speak. On my far left is Jeremy Waldron, who's the university professor here and professor in the School of Law, of course. Jeannie Suck, who's a professor at the Harvard Law School. Viviana Bonilla-Lopez, who's a 2L here. And John Haidt, who is the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at the Stern School of Business here at NYU. So Jeannie is holding the flag for everybody else. So what I wanted to do, we're going to discuss for a little under an hour, and then we'll leave room for your questions and comments. When that happens, please remember to wait until a microphone arrives so that we can hear you, and you'll also be recorded. I want to start by just getting the panelists here to think a little bit about the classroom in particular as a locus of freedom of expression. We do have traditions of civility in the classroom, but a classroom is a zone of academic freedom, but it's one that the teacher has some right to regulate, certainly on grounds of relevance, for example, but also on grounds of process, presumably, in order to manage the participation of students. I assume it's also thought generally to be all right to ask students to avoid explicit insults, vulgarity, and the like. On the other hand, civility has not traditionally been regarded as barring the expression of sincerely held beliefs, however upsetting they might be to others in the classroom. So it largely regulates manner rather than matter. But there are a couple of recent developments that might be thought to be challenges to that tradition. One is to do with the rise of issues that from a legal point of view derive from things like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, where on a psychotherapeutic model, as it were, people need accommodations if, for example, they have post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's one kind of case. And another kind of issue, new issue perhaps, which rises out of Title IX, for example, is sexual harassment, hostile environment issues, where the issue is not mental disability, but rather participation on terms of social equality. At least that's how it seems to me. But I wanted to start by asking Viviana to just talk a little bit about the issues of accommodation that arise in this context and to think about how they relate to questions of freedom of expression.
Of course. So I think particularly when we're talking about being in the classroom and making sure that this is a safe environment for all students, one thing that comes up really often is this idea of content warnings. And the reason that I like bringing up the Americans with Disabilities Act is that, to me, content warnings are all about access. So I think of them as sort of collective reasonable accommodations. If you think about the purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same ability to participate and access to the same things that people who don't have disabilities do. And that's sort of the same idea behind content warnings. If you think about the way our society is organized, it's in an ableist way. It's to privilege people without disabilities, people who don't need these kinds of accommodations. And that's sort of an arbitrary choice. Like, why did we decide to organize our society that way? If we think about things like sidewalks, for example, like, why are curbs elevated? We've added ramps in order to make sure that people with wheelchairs can access sidewalks. And those benefits all kinds of people, people with their groceries, people with strollers. So content warnings in the classroom, they're really similar. They don't just benefit people who might be triggered or traumatized by content, but also sort of everybody by sort of setting an idea that this will be a safe space for this conversation. It signals to those who might not have those experiences, hey, this is an area where I maybe need to take a second look to be a good ally, to be a good peer. And I think that it's also really important to think about when we say things like, oh, those are inconvenient, or why should I have to do this? Why should I have to change the way that I teach? I feel like we're making people from marginalized communities invisible, and we're pretending that they're not there. Why should we have to wait for someone who has experienced sexual violence to come forward and ask for a content warning when we know that 1 in 4 women in college will go through this. When we refuse to affirmatively do these things, to affirmatively make our classrooms safer for people, we're pretending that people from marginalized communities are invisible and that they're not there. And I think that that's a problem.
Okay. Anybody want to comment on this? Yes, John.
I'd be happy to. So I think it's helpful to take the accommodationist perspective, and we certainly all want people to feel that the classroom is open to them. We don't want people coming to the classroom and being afraid. But first, I would question, is there any evidence or reason to think that giving content warnings or trigger warnings actually will do this? As a psychologist, I've been looking into this, and the more you label things as potentially threatening, the more they develop a certain power to actually threaten. So think about it this way. I teach classes in the business school here. Suppose I took my students on field trips all over New York. But every time we went to the Bronx, I said, now, today, we're going to the Bronx. Just want to let you know, we'll have an ambulance with us, we'll have police protection, but don't worry about it, we're going to the Bronx. And I only do that for the Bronx. What are people going to conclude about the Bronx? Now, if there was evidence that these warnings actually helped people get over PTSD, then we'd have to balance various things. But there isn't, and the therapists that I talked to, the people who study PTSD, were unanimous in saying that if someone has PTSD, the last thing you want to do is shield them from small reminders. In fact, the only way to get over the Pavlovianly conditioned fear is to let them be exposed to small things, and then nothing bad happens to them, and that's how the fear subsides. So I'm totally fine with being really explicit on the syllabus. We're going to cover these things. Of course, let people know before they join. But if in the course of daily teaching, you say, we're about to look at something that shows this, that, or the other thing, content warning, you're actually hurting the very people you want to help.
Can I
Of
respond
course.
to that? So, I mean, first, I don't understand how the warning about the Bronx could be the kind of thing that we're talking about. I actually think that that's probably a really problematic thing to say to your students.
Yeah, it would be. That's right.
And I don't think that there's anybody who's been requesting that, that these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. I take issue with this idea that, you know, you're helping students by not giving them a content warning. You know, if you think about this sort of, that's what you're talking about is therapy. It's a treatment that happens in a therapeutic setting, and I don't think that it's like up to a professor to tell someone that what's best for them in their treatment and wherever they are in their development
But
to
can I just-
listen to something.
Can I just ask a question? I mean, the normal model of an accommodation is somebody notifies you that they
Yeah.
need an accommodation, they describe it, and if it's a medically required accommodation, then the Americans with Disabilities Act requires you to do something about it. But you're talking about something slightly different, right? You're talking about, as it were, anticipating that there might be a need for an accommodation in every class. Is that right? In
Yeah.
every class where any topic that might produce this. Why isn't it a better model just to get people to ask
Well,
for
I think
accommodation?
that we need to shift the burden from people from marginalized communities and forcing them to sort of come forward in the way that we know will stigmatize them, in a way that we know like puts them in harm's way or makes them have to be vulnerable when we already know what their needs are. And this is a situation is the system is made to benefit people who have privilege in our society. And it's that way because someone made that choice. Why aren't we shifting that? Like, why aren't we questioning that that's the way that it's set up?
Gina?
Yes, so I'm a teacher of many topics that students and all people really find very difficult. Like, I teach criminal law and family law. We deal with rape and abortion, homicide, divorce, very emotionally charged, morally charged topics. And I agree with Viviana that in the beginning, it makes sense to say, hey, you're taking this class. This is a class that's going to be really horrifying in terms of the kinds of problems. This is the drama of what it means to be human. And it involves problems that lots of people, including those people in this very room, and it's not just about sexual assault. I know from my 10 years of teaching that there are people, usually when I'm teaching criminal law, who have had all kinds of things touch their lives, whether it's family members who've been to prison, or people who've been racially profiled, or people who've had law enforcement officers and their families who've been killed, or people who've had relatives executed and had the death penalty. And it just goes on, and it is not clear to people in the room looking around that these people are there, but they're always there. In year after year, when you find out from students as they tell you their specific connection to the course, you now come to expect that every year it is something you should assume, that there are people in the room who have experienced all of these things. My disagreement with Viviana comes from the idea that this is just about marginalized people, because what I've heard year after year is it's not just from the marginalized perspective that people feel that they want a content warning and trauma and talk about their trauma. It is now people from all kinds of experiences who want that content warning. So I do not believe this is a problem of marginalized communities. I think it's a problem of our culture, where people want to feel like you are signaling to them that you care with sensitivity and respect about the sensitive experiences, the difficult experiences they have been through. I believe a teacher can do that by signaling at the beginning, as I'm sure Professor HAIDT does, that these are heavy, difficult issues. We're all going to confront them together. And obviously, any student, people can miss class for any reason. They don't need to have a special reason. They can miss class because they didn't feel like coming. They can miss class because they're sick. They can miss class because the class is about police brutality and they don't want to be there that day. They can do that if they want. But the bottom line is, I do think that the idea of signaling as you approach each topic, oh, this one might be especially traumatic, or this one might set you off, or this one, I think that is a very bad idea. First of all, it's unequal. I mean, there are many, many topics that have this potential for many, many people. And so in terms of the effectiveness of relieving people's suffering as they sit in your class, I have grave doubts about whether a specific content warning about any given topic is at all effective. And I think that it's really a much better thing to be upfront in the beginning about the common encounter that we're all going to have together with very, very difficult topics, and if you can't do it in a setting like, say, a law school classroom, where in the world in society can you do it?
Yeah, I have no difficulty with content warnings or trigger warnings, whether they're general or particular. I do accept Jeannie's point and John's too, that I think there are certain classes where it makes sense to have content warning and content discussion up front. I'm more interested in the background principles that should frame that. And one certainly ought to say in certain classes, and maybe in general on campus, that, look, you are here to learn how to come to terms with ideas that are intellectually difficult, but also morally difficult. Difficult ideas, difficult topics, disconcerting ideas, ideas that are going to challenge you, and certainly uncomfortable debates. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand what you're doing in the classroom. And everybody has an obligation, if they can, if it's not an inhumane imposition, to remain present in the face of those difficulties. Somebody wants to find civility as remaining present in the face of radical, deep disagreement, radical, deep discomfort. But the other side of that, I mean, so that's one side of what's happening in a classroom, on campus, in the study of law, is that you are preparing yourself for a lifetime of professional dealing with difficult topics. But the other side of it is that you deal with those topics as a professional. That is, the obligations of civility that Anthony mentioned, and the obligations that you are learning how to conduct yourself in relation to other people who have sensitivities and who have traumas that need to be respected. And so that we have a insistence that these two principles complement each other, a principle of very strong civility and sensitivity, both on the part of teacher and the students in their dealings with one another, and an awareness on behalf of everybody concerned that coming to terms with difficult ideas, disconcerting ideas, and uncomfortable debates is the name of the game. That is what we are training people to do.
Just, I think Viviana wanted to say, did you? No. I'm not going to, I mean,
You can go ahead.
if John wants to say something,
Okay.
you're thinking about
So-
it, let's John
okay.
in and then we'll let you in
Yeah.
afterwards.
So I think what we're seeing here, and what I've seen a lot in the last 6 months, is a gigantic generational divide. Anthony started this section by talking about how civility does not mean that you
I'm of the very, very old generation, in case you're wondering.
born before or after 1980 is the key.
Yes, yes.
Those born before 1980 generally think, as Jeremy just said, you're here to learn to come to terms with ideas that might be upsetting, disconcerting. Anthony said civility means, of course, you shouldn't be insulting and you shouldn't be afraid of being attacked, but you don't have a right to expect that you won't encounter. So this is the view of most people born before 1980. This is more the classic liberal tradition. This is John Stuart Mill. We know that we are imperfect. We know that we are biased and prone to post hoc reasoning. We need opposition to help us learn, to help us grow. We need that. Now, what happened in America after 1980, we had a string of child murders and abductions. We had cable TV. We had milk cartons. We had a real crime wave, too. American child-rearing norms changed radically in the early 80s. And so kids born after that had much, much less time unsupervised. Kids born before then had a lot of time in their childhood unsupervised. If they got into trouble with each other, if someone calls you a stupid idiot, you either call them a stupid idiot back or you punch them. But for those born after 1980, in general, there's always an adult around, always an authority that you go to. And so what we're seeing much more since 2000 or so is that undergraduates in particular come out of high school where they've been protected, where they have never had, there's zero tolerance for bullying, which is a good thing, but there's what's called moral dependency. People born after 1980 are much more likely to be in a state of moral dependency. If somebody has done something to me, I won't deal with it myself. I will get an adult authority, a bureaucratic authority, the diversity department, something to punish the person who did this to me. And this makes it impossible to teach. This makes it impossible to have an intellectual community because everybody's afraid. If I say something wrong, somebody in the class is going to call in a drone strike on me.
I think Viviana and Jeannie both, and maybe even Jeremy, those of us from the remote generations, have something to say about this. Viviana and then Jeannie.
Okay. So I think that it's really important to make a distinction between instances of discomfort and systemic oppression. So when we're talking about systemic oppression, we're talking about when societies, laws, customs, practices are all set up in a way to discriminate and treat unjustly a certain group of people. Instances of discomfort is a time when, like, my feelings were hurt. But the thing that was said to me or what was done to me isn't something that reinforces systemic oppression. These are two different things. And I think that it's important to realize that despite the fact that I feel like the other side is sort of co-opting this idea of being offended and oppressed, it isn't true. Only people who have been systemically oppressed can sort of make that claim in a way that it's, reflective of injustice in our society. And I think the importance of bringing that up is because what you're sort of talking about, and I feel like the attempt is to make us, students who are asking for these accommodations, students who are asking for accountability, seem weak. And I resent that. I don't think that it is a weakness to aspire for a society where we don't hurt each other. And I think that what we're talking about is impact and accountability for that impact. In fact, in our own safe spaces, we talk about, assuming best intentions, but also owning your impact. And I think that what we're asking of our professors, of our universities, of the classroom space is that people do this, that they own their impact, that if they said something that reinforces our unjust society, the way it's set up, something that reflects systemic oppression, that impact is owned, that person is accountable for what they've said. And I think that actually encourages free speech and it encourages this discourse and it just makes it accessible for everyone. We're talking about, in reality, this debate isn't about free speech. It's about how do we make sure that voices that have been silenced are actually listened to now. We are here, we're demanding that we be treated fairly, that we not be treated unjustly, and we're letting you know these are the ways in which you've systemically hurt me.
But I'm sorry, but the the snapping. So if we go back to the 1970s, the military had terrible race problems. It was an extremely racist place. Corporations had a lot of sexism, racism problems. And universities, I presume, were better places than to be in the military. Universities are very progressive, very concerned about race and gender issues, about oppression, marginalization issues. Over the 30 years after that, the Army has very largely solved its racism problems. It's a much more equal place, much higher satisfaction among black sergeants and black officers. So they've made a lot of progress. Corporate America's made a lot of progress. But as far as I can tell, many people are saying that the universities have not made progress or are getting worse. And this is what I don't understand. So you're saying that that universities such as NYU are so systemically racist and oppressive that these means are necessary to hold the professors accountable. So can you just explain, what do you mean when you say that these places are so racist and oppressive? These universities have been trying really hard for a long time. What is it that they haven't done?
So I think, I mean, it's sort of undeniable that, these institutions were not built for us. And when I say for us, I'm speaking broadly about members of marginalized communities,
That's fine,
people who
yeah.
are low income, people of color, LGBTQIA people, people with disabilities. These institutions were sort of built in a way to perpetuate systems that are racist. This is undeniable. And what I'm saying is that there's a difference between saying like, oh, hey, it's great that you're here. I'm going to put you on my pamphlet and show everybody how diverse I am, and actually making sure that the classroom is a safe place for me, a place where I have the same opportunity as students who have privilege to just sit there and be able to learn and not have to be fending off constantly all of these sort of, like violent acts that are thrown my way. And
Violent? Is there violence?
I mean, I think that violence is not just limited to sort of physical things.
Right. Right.
And I thought that you would take issue with that notion.
That's called concept creep, yes.
Yeah.
So, I hope you've
Yeah, no, I think that
you've
that's-
made your point.
that's good for now.
Jeannie wanted to say something, Jeremy wanted to say something, then I'm going to move us along a little bit.
I think that there is some amount of parsing and separation of certain concepts that really needs to happen here. So I am a teacher who focuses in my teaching very much on systemic oppression. I would say that is the primary approach that I take in teaching criminal law and family law. However, I do not believe that content warnings are in anything like responsive to the problem of systemic oppression. In fact, they are piecemeal, they're Band-Aids, they're acts that say, oh, we acknowledge that this thing might be painful. That's not the way to deal with systemic oppression. The way to deal with systemic oppression is to talk about it in its fullness, in its horror, in the way in which it hurts. And I believe that to say, this is a warning, it does nothing to actually put forward the idea that we need to confront these things. We need to have conflict about these things. And that's what it's not a systemic solution to focus on individual trauma or trauma as a member of a group. I want to take into account Viviana's idea that discourses about being traumatized belong to certain groups that are marginalized. They do not belong to other groups that we consider not marginalized. I do not believe that ideas belong to any groups. I think that all arguments are flippable, and that when you see arguments move across a culture, that is just called cultural influence. If today conservatives are talking about, say, negative comments about Justice Scalia as traumatizing, I do not believe that is co-optation primarily. I believe it is influence through cultural concepts of what it means to object to something, what it means to say, I don't like this. Today, the way you do that is to say, it hurts me in this specific psychological way. I feel traumatized. And so it's not just marginalized students, it's not just Asian American students, it's not just women who are doing it, it is everyone who now couches their objections, political and otherwise, in terms of the language of trauma. And I think that this is very important in a time when we are having a lot of serious conversations about sexual assault, sexual violence, and sexual harassment, because the concept of a hostile environment, which is very central to the concept of sexual harassment, is now very much linked to the idea that you traumatize someone by doing something that is either harassing or violent. And given that we now have this concept, as Viviana mentioned, verbal acts are considered harassing. You know, that's one of the ways in which you can harass someone. So then when you say something verbal in a classroom, people can say that that creates a hostile environment and that I am traumatized. Now, these are developments that are happening because we have an expansion of the idea of violence, just as the debate between Jonathan and Viviana just revealed. But it's also, we have to just watch that. We can't just let it actually slide into absolutely everything that people feel objections to. We can take seriously violence and harassment without actually letting it completely slide to the point where something that I disagree with or something that actually I find oppressive, right? Because it's an argument that I find oppressive, that's an act of violence. I don't think that that's the way forward for a university that values real debate about very contested ideas.
I think I agree with that. There has to be a place where if there is disagreement about systemic oppression, where if there is disagreement about justice and injustice, there has to be a place where that disagreement can be played out in open and civil debate among professional people. There has to be such a place. Now, a university is a very peculiar institution. A law school is even more peculiar institution, because we devote ourselves to talking through these issues about disagreement and conflict. And so we commit ourselves to acknowledging that people will have views other than our own, and because the stakes are so high, because of what these views are about, we are acknowledging that people are going to be disconcerted and made to feel uncomfortable by these debates. You can't run a university without that. You can't run a university simply as a reinforcement society. People have to learn to listen to opposing voices. They need to learn how to listen respectfully and respond respectfully to the voices of those who have experienced systematic oppression. They need to be able to learn how to criticize such voices and to respond to criticism. And that's part of the deal or the bargain of coming to a university. And that, as I said, has to be complemented by the most stringent duties of respectfulness and civility in relation to that. But you can't do it any other way.
But so, Jeannie, you brought up the idea of a hostile environment, and you were worried that if we turn any disagreement into an occasion for someone to claim that the environment has been made hostile to them, we won't be able to talk about anything. How should we corral in the notion of hostile environment as it relates to the classroom? And then we can move out to the wider campus in a minute. But how do you think we should, I mean, is it a relevant notion? How is it a relevant notion in relation to teaching and learning?
I think it's very difficult once the gates are open. But that challenge is something we're up to. We have to actually heed that challenge, understand what it is. Because, yes, can you say, I felt distressed in class, and that affected my ability to learn, and because it affected my ability to learn, it's now a hostile environment for me, because what happened in class made me feel distressed or traumatized. Yes, is that a series of steps that we can all follow? Of course it is. But at some point, you have to have some substantive conception. It can't be just up to any individual to say that subjectively what they feel is equal to a hostile environment. There's got to be some kind of substantive conception that we have together as a community, and these conversations, like the ones Viviana is having with us and with her peers, they're important for us to work out what that substantive conception will be. And so at some point, there's going to be a place where we say, yes, it's a hostile environment because there were verbal things that occurred, and that is a hostile environment. It affects your ability to learn and to have an equal education at your university. But I think that it's very hard when we rely so much on the concept of trauma to explain what makes a hostile environment, because trauma is by definition, psychological and subjective. And so we need to kind of de-link the hostile environment concept from this trauma concept that has grown so much over the years to almost engulf it.
I'd like, as I just said, I'd like to move out a little bit from now beyond the classroom. The campus is part of the world of the university as well, and we have, you already mentioned, or you adverted to something that I will now mention explicitly, which is the complaint of two professors at our colleague institution at Georgetown about a criticism mounted among the faculty by a member of the faculty against the dean's decision to speak only approvingly of Justice Scalia when his death was announced. And a couple of days later, one of the professors there pointed out that he had been made to feel uncomfortable by the fact that it was the dean had spoken as if everybody on campus had the same positive view of Justice Scalia, and so he articulated some of his criticisms. I read the email. In my judgment, it was a reasonable discussion by a reasonable person of his disagreement with that view. Two members of the faculty, who self-identified conservative members, said that they thought that this was cruel to speak in this way within, they said a few hours, but it was in fact a couple of days of the death of Justice Scalia. So that was an observation, that was a sort of moral observation, this was cruel, but they also went on to say that because this professor had spoken in this way, he had made it difficult for conservative students, supporters of Justice Scalia, to feel okay in his classroom. Now, that put me in mind of another important campus freedom case over the last few years, when the University of Illinois withdrew an offer to a man called Professor Salaita, who had made, I think what he would even he would agreed were intemperate remarks on Facebook. He might have thought they were justified, but they were certainly intemperate. Remarks on Facebook about Israeli behavior in the Palestinian territories. He's of Palestinian ancestry. And so the university withdrew an offer to him, and he'd already resigned from his other job, so that put him in a difficult position, as the university has admitted, to the extent of having to spend $2 million compensating him and his lawyers and their lawyers. But one of the complaints they made, again, was the same complaint. If this guy comes to our campus, students who are supportive of Israel will not feel comfortable in his classroom. And so these are remarks made by professors which are held against them outside the classroom, which are held against them because it will produce an atmosphere in the classroom that will make it impossible for students with certain views to learn. And it struck me that that was an interesting, so in one case it was conservatives objecting, in the other case it was people objecting in the name of Israel. These are different cases, but they do have this interesting structure that people are complaining that there's a pedagogical reason why professors should be silent about these things. And I wonder what you think of that, Jeremy.
Well, it seems to me that if you just state it in that form, it's got to be rejected. The whole point of coming to a classroom, in many cases, is that you're going to be discomforted by what you hear, or you're going to have to make an uncomfortable adjustment to what you believe. You're going to have to develop your views in various ways in response to stuff that you wish you hadn't heard, but are going to have to hear. So if it's that degree of discomfort, then somebody says they want to be shielded from that, then they are, in a way, not understanding or showing that they're indifferent to the tough, difficult business of mutual adjustment of views that a classroom involves. I don't see why we should move from the fact that, yes, you will certainly be made uncomfortable when you hear my views about Justice Scalia, or you will certainly be made uncomfortable when you hear my views about what's happening in Gaza. Yeah? The whole point of such views being to shake up certain degrees of complacency. I don't see why we make the move, which you made very quickly in your comments, that this would lead to learning difficulties. It will lead to a different quality of experience in learning. But the notion that this takes a young person and makes it impossible for her to hear, or for him to listen, for him to respond or to criticize, in a place, I guess go back to this theme like a broken record, in a place whose raison d'etre is to allow us to engage with opposing views and learn how to respectfully disagree, respectfully criticize, and respectfully adjust.
Good. So thoughts about these cases? These sorts of cases where the suggestion is that something said by a professor, either in her writing or somewhere on Facebook or somewhere, might be inappropriate thing for them to say because knowing that they have those views might make it difficult for a student. I'm wondering if anybody has any sympathy for that line of thought.
Okay. So I think we need to understand what's going on campus against the larger background of rising political polarization. Began in Congress in the 90s. Some political scientists said it hasn't reached the mass level. But in the last 10 years, we have major mass polarization. People on the left and people on the right really dislike each other a lot more than they did 15 or 20 years ago. So that's going on. People come to campus. At the same time, the faculty have gone from leaning left in the 90s to being almost entirely left by 2005. So there used to be some diversity. There used to be the sort of place that Jeremy's talking about. When I was in grad school, there was that sort of place. But now in the social sciences, humanities, and law faculty, it's 5 to 1, 10 to 1, 15 or 20 to 1 sometimes. So we have to see what's happening as part of almost like an electromagnetic field that gets stronger and stronger. It's ripping us apart. And so political warfare by other means comes into the classroom and on campus. And if a professor expresses an opinion that has any political valence, whichever side they're on, now, the conservatives perceive that since the campus is overwhelmingly liberal, overwhelmingly on the left, and the two professors, they are the only two conservatives at Georgetown out of a faculty of more than 100. So they might have overreacted, but they are feeling aggrieved. They are feeling there is a hostile climate. And so they're correct. And what happens is in sociologists who've written about victimhood culture, it begins on the left. But over time, as they say here, insofar as they share a social environment, the same conditions that lead the aggrieved to use a tactic against their adversaries comes to be used on the right as well. So everybody takes on this vocabulary of, I'm traumatized, I'm a victim. And at that point, this kind of Platonic ideal that Jeremy's talking about ceases to exist. I think it ceased to exist sometime in the last couple of years.
So does anybody have any sympathy with that line of argument? With the argument that John was criticizing? I mean, in other words, in two cases, two universities, somebody made this argument, and I'm getting the sense that it doesn't get much uptake here. Does it get any uptake at all?
Well, I think it's important to clarify that at least the students that I work with are, we are not asking for these difficult conversations not to be had. In fact, I think a big part of what often makes us feel like we're being silenced or erased is in the classroom when a professor will gloss over like an issue of race or gender or, something complicated in a case or something that we're talking about. Erasure is also part of the things that we are sort of trying to fight against. So I think it's really important to clarify that we're not against free speech and we're not against these difficult conversations. I think that there's a difference between us asking for accountability and us asking for sort of total silence.
So when you ask for accountability, what does that mean?
I mean, I think it means that if a professor or a person or a student or anybody says something that they, maybe had the best intentions when they said it, but they didn't realize that it had this negative impact on another person, that they own it, that they learn from it, that we grow and understand the ways in which we can, hurt each other. I think that these particular instances, it's really hard if you're trying to ask me to sort of draw a bright line about, what things are okay and what are not. I certainly have some ideas of what are on the not okay side, but
Just a little bit on this accountability.
Yes.
yeah, of course, go ahead.
Because, Viviana, I think you're absolutely right that professors particularly have to be accountable for everything they do, everything they say in the classroom. That doesn't mean to say that they should silence themselves. Mm-hmm. It means to say that they should be self-conscious, they should be aware, and if something is difficult or controversial and it is making people feel uncomfortable, they should be prepared to give an account of why, nevertheless, it was necessary to say it. And you would include that under the heading of accountability, right?
Yeah, and then, and we can respond to that as well.
You can respond to that as well. Yes, indeed.
But so just to be clear, though, what's needed is an atmosphere in which someone can civilly call someone to account. That is, say, I think you just glossed over, right? I mean, you said that people should own the consequences of what, but if they don't know what the consequences are, they can't own them. So part of it is about creating an atmosphere in which people can ask for the account. So accountability is a matter of being called to account and having an atmosphere in which you will give an account if you're called to an account. Right, great. Yes, Jeannie.
Just accountability has a lot of different meanings, and one of them is one that Viviana brought out, but another one often is discipline by the university or by the law school. Often you say, I want to hold the person accountable by having them punished or having them disciplined. And that's where the experience of, for example, myself and my colleagues, we have had the experience of publishing things, expressing views critical of, say, Title IX policies, and being told that we had created a hostile environment, as opposed to, we disagree with your views, and here's why you are wrong. And when someone says hostile environment, what that means is you should be disciplined and punished and potentially suspended from your teaching duties or kicked out of the university. And it's just a different form of accountability. And I think that is what, the best form of accountability is someone actually scrutinizing what you say and telling you why you are misguided, why you are incorrect, why you should change your view, be persuaded to hold a different one. That's accountability. But the hostile environment thing, which sometimes people think is accountability because you're holding people responsible, that actually has the opposite effect. It's not that accountable because it just says, let's not have this conversation because that's out of bounds.
Right. But there will be occasions when some degree of discipline might be appropriate. I remember, and I won't go into the details, but I was at Columbia Law School when somebody produced a first-year criminal law exam, which by any account was an abuse of professorial authority. And the dean mentioned to this person that this was an inappropriate exam to have given. And suddenly Nadine Strossen is brought in the American Civil Liberties Union, as though any attempt by the dean to assess the way the examination function had been performed was inappropriate. I don't think you can rule out that there are some things that professors do in their classrooms. There are some insensitivities that professors repeatedly show that might require intervention of something more than a free speech, the sense of accountability that I was talking about earlier.
John.
So accountability sounds like a great idea, but I think we need to see how this plays out in practice from the perspective of professors who are trying to teach a course. So I'll share with you the story that made me so passionate about this topic. I was teaching a course here at NYU 2 years ago, and I showed a research video showing an experiment that I had done 15 years earlier at the University of Virginia. There's a conversation between two students. As part of trying to persuade each other on something, one of them makes an argument about whether gay marriage and gay sex are moral issues or not, and he's saying they're not. And to respond to another student's point, he says, I mean, like, if I were to see it happening, and he says that he would not like to witness two men having sex, but, it's perfectly okay. The fact that I don't like it doesn't make it wrong. So by the time the lecture is over, this is a video I showed of two undergraduates having a conversation. By the time the lecture was over, the one student had emailed the dean about my homophobia, and it led to it basically brought the course to a standstill over the next week. I thought for sure the student had simply not understood that the student in the video was actually very pro-gay rights. But it turned out that she had understood it. It's the fact that it made her uncomfortable that somebody expressed a personal discomfort, personal dislike of seeing two men having sex. This was homophobia, and I had to be punished. And so she bullied me into an apology. I finally apologized because the course was at a standstill. But she didn't like my apology, so she filed charges against me in the Equal Opportunity Office here at NYU. Now, there's no way I would have been convicted. But I lost several weeks of my life. There was a social media campaign against me. I was called homophobia in all kinds of blogs and the press. And I'm incredibly anti-homophobia. I mean, but this is the thing. This is why you see these headlines now. I'm a liberal professor, and my liberal students scare me because your intentions don't matter anymore. Did the most sensitive student in the class feel unsafe? If so, you're accountable. And so what's happening in the last 2 years, ask your professors about this, what's happening is we're ditching anything that could trigger that most sensitive student. I don't show any videos anymore, I don't tell jokes, I skip topics. You can call it erasure, but I call it the reaction to hyper-accountability by vindictive guardians of what they see as the moral order. So as far as I'm concerned, again, that university that Jeremy is talking about, I don't think that exists anymore in this country.
Jeannie, I'm going to suggest that I'm going to let Jeannie say something, and then I'm going to suggest I haven't gotten through. I had a lot more things we might have talked about, but inevitably, since this is a campus and we are all in class together, this is probably going to be one of the central things that you want to talk about. But if you want to raise issues about, for example, disinvitation of off-campus speakers, which is not about the classroom and not about professors, you're more than welcome to do so. That's another topic in this area. But I'd like Jeannie just to help
Yeah,
us
so
turn towards
Jonathan,
the conversation.
I too have heard from a lot of my fellow colleagues about how they have changed their course materials over the last several years as these issues have become more salient. I have teachers who are basically taking their contracts course or whatever course and just basically whitewashing it of any controversial cases or articles. And I hear you to be saying that you have engaged
done
in a
it. Everyone's
similar
doing it.
endeavor. And what I guess my comment is that I don't think we should do that. I don't think that we should be understanding the students to want that. And I think that we should be taking seriously claims like the one Viviana made, that what they want is the opposite of that. What they want is those kinds of hot materials to be in the course and addressed openly and with the acknowledgement of conflict. So what I would say is, with respect, maybe please don't do that anymore. And I don't want my colleagues to do that anymore. I want those topics to be taught, and we should just confront the challenge. And yes, maybe we will be called racists or homophobes as a result of trying to teach about racism and homophobia. Maybe that will happen. But I think the majority of students will also understand that that is not actually true. And I think that we have to have a little bit more trust in the process of reason in our student bodies. And it's not actually going to happen that all of us are going to be kicked out off campus as sexual harassers if each of us actually stands up to this cultural development. And I think that taking a course and not teaching these controversial materials is not standing up to it. I think we really need to stand and say, we believe in this. We believe in teaching about things like systemic oppression, and the only way to do that is actually to really talk about it. And it's going to be controversial. It's going to be scary. And it's going to be scary for each of us, the teachers and the students. We're all at risk. And I think that we just need to have that courage and just do it.
Good. All right. Let's have that courage. There are microphones available. If you raise a hand, the microphone will somehow magically approach you. Here, there's people on this side, at least. I can't see anybody over there yet. One in the front. Why don't we start there and we'll move forward.
Hi.
Hi.
So, should I say my name?
If you want to.
Okay.
Just to say, you don't have to say a name, but if you do, that's fine.
Okay, my name is Michelle. My question is for Viviana, because you seem to be fighting the hardest for like marginalized groups, and I don't think anyone's disagreeing with the points you're making, but how would you draw the line between trigger warnings and like a very sensitive individual or group who decides to obstruct the greater learning environment just because they were triggered or made uncomfortable by something that happened in the classroom? Especially since, like, as Professor Suk has brought up, a lot of students go into these classes knowing that there might be emotional content because, like, they're discussing very, very sensitive law, maybe, and they get class syllabi. So how much of that accountability would fall to the student who's taking the class and knowingly sitting in on this content, and how much of it would fall to the professor who has to teach around maybe like a very sensitive individual instead of trying to teach the entire course?
Viviana.
So I do think it's important to sort of think also, while it is scary to think, oh, I might offend someone and be called out about it, and what will that say about me and my reputation? It's actually much scarier to be that person, right, who could be impacted and who is being impacted every day of their lives because of an identity that they hold. I think that I feel like this idea of obstructing learning in the classroom, we have to be careful with that. I think, oftentimes in classrooms when we sort of call something out or question something that was said as like, maybe you didn't realize that this has these implications, I don't think that that's obstructing learning. I think that it's like bringing us into that uncomfortable conversation that we really do need to have in order to not erase, these experiences. And I think that, there is a responsibility of the professor to sort of balance that with what they want to teach. But I feel like there's just this constant burden on people from marginalized communities to, continue to invoke that, that we always have to be the ones calling things out, or we always have to be the ones making note of when something went wrong, because if we don't do it, then there's this like complicitness of like, that was okay to say. If that's viewed as obstructing learning, I don't feel like we should apologize for that. Like, that's part of this process, is that people who didn't have to think about that because they hold a certain kind of privilege, now they have to. And I think that professors should learn to manage that. They should learn to invite that, and they should learn to make that a part of their teaching.
Yes. Yes. Yes, sure. Go ahead.
I think there's
You need the microphone, though.
I think there's like a very distinct difference between like educating people with historical privilege about the experiences that historically marginalized groups have been through, and like obstructing learning just because like a small group of individuals are made extremely uncomfortable by like a certain thing that happened in class. So like with Professor Haidt's example, like there was this one girl who thought he was homophobic because he showed that video in class, but instead of bringing it up to him and like turning it into a discussion, she assumed the very worst of him, went straight to the dean, got like charges pressed against him. So where would you draw the line? How would you balance that? Because right now the balance doesn't seem to be in the professor's favor.
I mean, these like line drawing and sort of like, putting me in a position to sort of be a referee on when was okay, when it wasn't okay, it's not something I'm comfortable with. But I do think that, assuming students who have experienced trauma, who have been through these difficult things, like we need to start not assuming that, like we need to start sort of believing them and listening to their experiences and listening to times when they're hurt and like giving validity to those experiences, not just dismissing it as, oh, you didn't give me the benefit of the doubt. Giving people the benefit of the doubt can sometimes be pretty difficult. It's important, but it's we have to like not just sort of like label people as too sensitive, but instead listen to them, because there is a reason that their voices aren't being heard. There is a reason that they're considered a minority or like a small group. We have to listen to them.
I'd like to add on just one point. I think Viviana's point about giving the benefit of the doubt is absolutely crucial here. Diversity is hard. We're coming together with people who are different from us, especially moral and political diversity is really hard. So one thing that I would suggest, I'm starting to suggest wherever I get the chance, is let's rethink what's the summer reading list for new students. Let's rethink what are the shared experiences. And rather than, most summer reading lists are recent books about racism and colonialism and inequality. Rather than starting with that sort of training to be upset about privilege, why don't we require John Stuart Mill on liberty, Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Dhammapada.
Who's the dinosaur now?
But if we would start by recognizing, we need to have these difficult conversations, and they can only be had if we all give each other the benefit of the doubt, and we don't naturally do that. It's really, really hard. So this has to be a shared project to recognize we're all incredibly self-righteous, moralistic, well, curse word there. And so, yes, we have to give each other the benefit of the doubt, and this is what has disappeared. There's the idea is accuse first, and then social media after that. So if you feel marginalized, if you think someone has done something, talk to the person. Don't bring in the adult reinforcements.
Yes.
Hi, I have so many thoughts from this excellent panel, but I guess speaking about language, which was brought up a couple of times, I wonder if we could address a little bit using the language of disability in this context, because as we were all talking, I thought about there was a big controversy here on campus to do with political issue last semester with a visiting professor, as you were saying, and that was nothing to do with disability, that was nothing to do with people, as far as I understood it, people feeling personally hurt, but it was a political issue that people wanted to engage in. And so I wonder if by using the label, like we say, of trauma, and then using the label of disability, there's a lot of issues in that, first of all, can kind of stigmatize a group of people saying you have a disability that might not feel like they have a disability, and second of all, kind of eliminates the ability to have larger conversations.
Well, so I think this is very important to bring up, especially since this event was billed as the Milbank Tweed Forum.
Right.
And about campus speech, and I teach at a school where we've been dealing with a Milbank controversy in the last few days.
You should describe it.
Yeah,
I don't think most people
sure,
know
I'll
about it.
describe it.
We don't all follow in great detail
so-
everything that goes on at Harvard.
Right. So Milbank Tweed gives money to Harvard Law School, like hundreds of thousands every year for all student events. So this law school just doles out the money to all of the student groups. And Justice for Palestine, a student group, held an event that really was asking the question whether there's an exception to free speech for pro-Palestinian views being expressed on campus. So in other words, like, do we believe in free speech until someone wants to express a pro-Palestinian view? That was the event itself. And when they advertised the event as required by saying, generously supported by Milbank Tweed, turned out Milbank Tweed really did not want that association. And so they asked that the law school ask the student organizations to not advertise it that way. And then as a result of whatever conversations followed, Milbank Tweed decided not to fund any more student events, but rather to move their funding over to other ways to support Harvard Law School because of this problem of political views being associated with their company, their firm. And I think that this is important because Jeremy mentioned, the special nature of a university, what it is we're here to do, to have political as well as other kinds of disagreements, and to really have those debates and to search for truth and produce knowledge about those things. But the university can't exist without funding from non-university institutions, such as corporations and private firms. And so I think there is an issue here about politics. In a vacuum and in an ideal world, we would love it to be that all political views, or at least most of them, of course, one can imagine that the community could decide there are some views that are so beyond the pale that we don't actually have to provide a forum for their expression and debate. But by and large, we want to have a place where a whole range, an enormous range of political views can exist and be expressed and be disagreed with. But I think that it's always a perennial problem when it's not just the university. We exist here because of funding from other parties who have certain views that they don't want prominently displayed or prominently expressed. And so I think it's something that's very difficult because we have our community norms, but we also have our existence. How do we go on if we don't have the support from either the students or the alumni or the parties that actually give us the funds to just run the school? And I think it's always a compromise. I do not have the position that this is, we're pure, and so we have to act like we're pure. It is a compromise.
Jeremy.
It is a compromise, but if there's a discipline upon students, and if there's a discipline upon professors to play their part in this ideal of a place where disagreements can be raised, even when it's uncomfortable for the professor to have to deal with them, or it's uncomfortable for students, then we have to impose, and it sounds like a recipe for bankruptcy, we have to impose that discipline on donors too. They have to understand it's a university you're contributing to, not a political party. It's a university you're contributing. Do you know what a university is? And we want to say it more diplomatically than that, when there are millions at stake. But just as we say that to governments who fund public universities, or governments that are giving grants for research at public universities, so we have to say it to private donors as well. Remember the nature of the institution that you're funding here. This is going to be an institution where hard things will be said, difficult topics raised, and uncomfortable debates take place.
Yes. Yes, you've got a microphone, so you get to speak.
Okay.
The conch.
Hi. I had a question for Professor Haidt relating to your anecdote. Haidt? Did I hear?
Yes, Haidt.
Yeah, Haidt. Sorry. I understand why going to the dean and filing a complaint against you was, I understand why the prospect of official censure was worrisome and something you objected to, but you also mentioned that this caught on social media, that a lot of people were calling you homophobic on social media, and that seemed to also be something that you found objectionable. And that was somewhat confusing to me from a free speech, freedom of expression perspective, although I understand why you would take issue with people saying things about you that aren't true. It seems like what you're describing is one person forming an opinion, expressing it, other people joining that opinion, and also expressing it. So I was wondering if you could unpack for me exactly what the, not the school potentially censoring you, but the social media aspect of it.
I don't understand the contradiction. I never said that they don't have a right to say anything. I didn't like it. I didn't like having my reputation dragged through the mud for when I thought I was innocent, but there's no free speech issue here. I don't understand.
So maybe I misunderstood you. It seemed to me like you were describing that as one of the number of bad outcomes that you think followed from this, and objectionable outcomes from a freedom of expression perspective. Not that you said they didn't have a right to do it, but this was, it seemed to me lumped in with the idea that you might face official censure was the fact that a number of people formed bad opinions about you and repeated them on social media.
Right. So the issue we were discussing here with Viviana was the issue of accountability. And accountability sounds like a good idea. In practice, some of my colleagues have a lot of faith in the system. And it is true. I also, again, there was no way I was going to be convicted. But the process is the punishment. If professors know that they will not be fired, they will not be convicted, but yet, anytime a student is offended, there will be a social media campaign against them. They will lose weeks of their work. They'll have to defend themselves. People will be crawling through everything they've ever written. I mean, it takes a lot of, we're all really busy. And if I know that at any moment I can lose a month of my life, I'm going to scrub my syllabus clean. I just don't have the time. So it's not a free speech issue here. It's what are the dynamics on campus? And if we think that classrooms are supposed to be safe spaces, in which professors must be held accountable if they violate that safety, that is not a place that I want to teach.
So Viviana mentioned that she was talking about students being held accountable too. That is, students have responsibilities in all this. And I think it is worth saying about the world of social media that we haven't yet developed what I think would be appropriate norms of responsibility. People pick up accusations and run with them on the basis of one person telling them something and doing no research at all into whether it's right or not. And mounting a campaign to hound someone on the basis of misinformation is irresponsible. Now, it doesn't mean it should be banned. It doesn't mean there should be laws against it. Right. Part of this is back to John Stuart Mill, who, like John, I'm a big fan of. Part of it is about the responsibility of the society to develop a culture in which we allow each other to say things, and that means we don't penalize people for saying things we don't like unless we have established for sure that they've said them and that they have the moral significance that we're claiming. And I'm afraid that that does not look like the world of the web to me.
Can I also say that there is an alternative to wiping your syllabus clean? We can also listen to students, listen to the things that hurt them, upset them, and not just that, things that are oppressive. You can learn how to talk about these issues. We're putting out all kinds of groups put out all kinds of information on what language is appropriate, what things you can say, what things will strike them this and that way. This information is out there.
But that would not protect you. If you watch the video of what happened to Dean Spellman at Claremont McKenna, if you read the transcript, a student wrote an essay of decrying privilege and cisphobia at Claremont McKenna, transphobia, I'm sorry, at Claremont McKenna. And this dean reached out to her, and you read the transcript of what the dean said, and it's clear she was really trying to help. She was concerned about her. And the student in her initial article had basically talked about the idea that there's this mold, there's this typical prototype at Claremont McKenna, and it's white and heterosexual male. And so this dean used the word mold. She did use the word mold. She said, I'm sorry that some people don't seem to fit into our CMC mold, but it's clear she was really being helpful, but she used the word mold. And she was crucified for it. You can find it on the web. It's basically a Maoist shame circle where they're taunting her, they're reducing her to tears for her incredible insensitivity. So listening to students will not protect you. The new regime is, if anyone is offended, you have committed an act of aggression, microaggression, but it's an aggression nonetheless, even a form of violence. And so this is where we are. Listening will not protect you.
Hi, excuse me, loud. My name's Eli. Just one quick comment. I work on China. I'm an expert. I work in the U.S. Asia Law Institute over here. I think it is very clear to draw a distinction between what we see now and the Cultural Revolution. It does not seem like the same thing. So, just because that was that one comment.
Well,
Now, I just want to zoom in on one really tiny point. So to me, the way that people talk about the kinds of aggressions or comments that cause difficulty in classroom sort of reflects a kind of theory of tort. To say, you harm me, we want to account for what that harm is. Somebody is harmed. And so my question is this: how much of this debate can be boiled down to how large you conceive of that harm being? There are other things that are being talked about as well. We've mentioned politics, we've mentioned other issues. But how much of the conversation specifically about what is or isn't said in classroom can be boiled down to that? And just to add one little piece to this, in my experience, or at least in situations where I've seen this come up, spaces when I was a student recently, it seems to be most significantly demonstrated in classroom situations where there was an inadvertent error speech, something that is kind of admitted by everybody as being really not terribly good or coming off wrong, like mold, but which causes a rather substantial amount of disagreement about how that should be treated. So, thank you.
so are you asking for a response?
Oh,
from the point of
yeah,
view
so
of the
I would
tort
love to
laws?
hear, just in general, feelings on how much of this disagreement is due to specific debate over how large this harm is, as opposed to any other influences.
An earlier questioner raised the issue about disability and asked us to say why we are focusing on that notion rather than just the sheer notion of disagreement. And it has to be that we begin our discussion of this matter by thinking about a range of possibilities. A traumatized response at one end can't be ruled out, can't be denied, and if that's a possibility, we have to use disability frameworks to think about it. But in most cases, it seems to me, going to be well short of that. In some cases, and this is where the most recent question arises, Eli's question, arises, that there will be great disputes as to whether people are magnifying or exaggerating the extent of their harm. It seems to me that this was obviously the case in the Justice Scalia example from Georgetown, probably being done for political and cynical reasons. So people have to be sometimes in a position to call and question the degree of harm that's being asserted. It's the most delicate and difficult thing to do because people say, are you telling me how I feel? No, but I'm wondering whether you were really traumatized within a disability framework by somebody saying something bad about Justice Scalia. So I don't think there's going to be any way of avoiding some discussion of how one actually feels and how grave the harm is. Certainly sometimes we will be saying there are certain forms of discomfort, like simply being offended by a view, as opposed to being, for example, silenced or reduced to an inability to function or traumatized. We might want to be able to point to differences of quality as well as differences of quantity of the types of things. But this has to be fair game for discussion as well if everything else is.
Right. Yes.
Hi. So I'm thinking about this in terms of, like, when you think about accommodations, I'm thinking about it in terms of costs and benefits of granting someone an accommodation. So, like, in the example of the curbs, right? The reason we have curbs is to, when it, like, rains, the water gets diverted into the drainage. Or, like, the reason why we don't install elevators into every building into New York City, even though it would benefit some people, is that we think the costs are high. So I guess my question on the benefits side, Professor Waldron, I want to direct this question at you. You say that, like, granting these accommodations, or I guess to everyone, maybe granting these accommodations and having trigger warnings is in some way going to diminish the benefits of like a free exchange of ideas at the school and the kind of diverse opinions that exist in the university. And I guess my question is, like, just as an empirical point, how do you measure the diversity and the benefits of the university as it exists today? Is there actual, do these conversations actually take place? Is there a lot of intellectual diversity at universities? And then as a follow-on, why not, like, I mean, would maybe non-university options for providing that kind of dialogue, so I'm thinking like Khan Academy, I'm thinking of like blogs or like open courseware from MIT, why can't that just provide the intellectual discourse we need in society and then just allow colleges and universities to be like fun places?
Yeah.
Like in social, I mean, really what they are, which is like social signaling tools and credentialing.
Professor Waldron, this is a free debate, so you're free to answer that question.
Right. I mean, there may be somebody on the platform who thinks trigger warnings are too costly in terms of the university's aspirations. I'm not that person. But it does seem to me that one of the things that John Haidt has brought up is whether the image of the university that my views are being predicated on and some of the other people's views on the platform are being predicated on is a non-reality now anyway. There isn't a great deal of confrontation of ideas. There isn't a great deal of genuine, uncomfortable debate taking place. And maybe that's right. I don't think in certain courses that you can preclude it. I think it's very important in law school that it always remain open. And as new forms of systematic social injustice are discovered and new claims about systematic injustice are made, you can't tell when that will trigger a debate and that needs to take place. I don't think it's inappropriate to have content warnings in cases where it's a reasonable person would predict that it's possible people may be deeply, deeply upset, that as part of their duty to conduct themselves as a responsible student, they may need to prepare themselves, or they may need to think very carefully about whether they want to attend this class or not. I have no problem with it. It's very, very hard to quantify the balance of costs and on either side. But I remain a staunch believer in the fact that a university and a campus, so the university and the adjacent speaking around in the campus, is a place, it's one of the few places where we have organized civil discourse on the most uncomfortable topics. So we try to organize our responsibilities of respect, sensitivity, and civility to that aspiration. We don't try to organize the respect, sensitivity, and civility purely for its own sake.
And I hope that we have managed to live, at least in this room, up to that image of what the university should be doing as a space for free expression. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to the panelists.